Emil Cadlick here with FantasyNation.com. We have a wonderful pioneer of fantasy sports guest today. He started in the business in 1993, and he was the FSGA president for 11 years. He really helped grow the business, and he was very influential in helping the small businesses be part of that growth. I'm really honored to introduce Paul Charchian. How are you today?
I am doing great. And I got the pleasure to work with you on the board of directors for many years. And I appreciate all of your contributions to the industry at large, all the careers that you've started, the employees that you've helped get launched. And, you know, there's for us old timers, you and I were talking before we started recording. I think we're top 5 for people that are the oldest people still in the industry, going back from the early 90s. This is old guy talking to old guy right now, Emil.
That's scary.
That's it's part of the fun of seeing this whole industry evolve so much, right? I mean, when you and I were doing it, we were still trying to explain to people that fantasy football is not Dungeons and Dragons.
Yes, exactly. It took a long time too. So when you were young, what were you interested in sports?
I was, especially football, but I liked all sports even as a kid, and you probably did too. And for me, a lot of it was hanging around my dad. You know, my dad worked a lot, and the one time I could be with my dad every week was football Sunday. And, you know, we'd be on the couch together, and I'd always have some dad time, and that was part of the fun of it. And then, you know, before video games and all the other distractions of life, you know, back when I was a kid, you played sports outside with your friends. And so it was, you know, backyard football and basketball and hockey and playing baseball and, you know, running around with friends. And that's what we did. We played sports. So yeah, growing up, sports are just incredibly vital to my youth. So yeah, I was always playing, and I assume to some degree you were too, Emil.
Yep. Yeah, they were very important. I was a dyslexic kid, so I was very insecure.
No kidding.
Yeah, I was dyslexic. I still am dyslexic. But as in the mid-'60s, the Cowboys were on TV, and they were winners. And so I was, you know, at 8, 9 years old, I could associate myself with them, and it made me feel better, important, comfortable. Kind of a weird thing we do. So,
well, you know, fascinating. Not to turn this conversation completely, but we're friends. We can chat for a minute. I mean, here you are. You're dyslexic, which I did not know, and I've known you for decades. I never knew that, and you work in the printed word for your whole career.
I'm an electrical engineer and a dyslexic electrical engineer, so I'm not very good with the written word. Ironically, I mean, I've got a good idea.
Don't get the plus and the minus backwards. Whatever you do.
That's right. A lot of was is saw and saw is was. It's hilarious. It was a difficult childhood. Not that we talk about me, because everybody thought I was stupid in the 60s. They thought I was mentally retarded.
I bet.
Yeah, because
I bet. How about that?
Yeah.
How long did it take for you? How long did it take to get an actual diagnosis?
It was around 68, 69, when it was about the 5th grade or 6th grade.
Okay.
They finally, and there was a place called Calvert Academy that I went to at that time, where they had these machines that would only show a certain section of the word, and they would run across the screen. So you were forced to watch the word as it came out from the beginning to the end to try and learn to read from left to right. Because dyslexic, you'll look at it as like a picture, like you look on a wall. You don't necessarily. Sometimes you see the end before the beginning, so you had to train your eyes. So yeah, it was an interesting time. But it's not about me today. It's about you.
Well, that's still a great story.
Yeah, it's crazy. So I'm not sure, did you go to college, and, you know, what were your kind of interests, you know, as you were growing up?
Yeah, so I went to the University of Minnesota, and I went to the School of Journalism, but I never thought I'd use it. Emil, I was a network administrator in college, and I was also doing classroom software training. So I had cobbled together jobs in college, and really thought, you know, there was so much more money in computer science than there was in journalism, and nobody gets an actual journalism job. So, you know, I never thought I'd actually use it. And for a couple of years I didn't. And then while I'm the network administrator at an accounting company, a coworker of mine came up with this idea, and he didn't know I was a journalism major. He just knew I loved fantasy football. And he said, there's nothing printed in season for fantasy football. Why don't we start a fantasy football magazine that runs in season? And back then, this is 1993, Emil, as you can appreciate, there was nothing written for fantasy then. You had preseason books and magazines, things like what you were doing, but in season there was just nothing. And so we spun up a magazine with no real skills and no understanding the magazine business, and just tried it.
I remember buying many of your fantasy football weeklies.
Thank you. I appreciate that.
They were wonderful. Who was the person that you got together with to form this idea?
Rob Phythian, and I know you know Rob, Emil, and he was a tax accountant. I was a network guy, and we just dove in, and we printed it out in tabloid format. So it was like newsprint almost, but it was it's still a magazine. We had to fill 24 pages a week, and we didn't back then. There was no roadmap for how to talk fantasy football, how to break down games and predict games for fantasy football, and what anybody even wanted. And so we just we were making it all up from an in-season standpoint. And lots of lessons learned, hard lessons. And you'll appreciate this because of your publishing background, Emil. So we did it 1 year in the Twin Cities only. So we're doing this test in the Twin Cities, and it sells great in the Twin Cities. And we just assumed that in the Twin Cities and Minneapolis, St. Paul's like every place else. So year 2, we start sending it to send the magazine to every NFL city. And huge mistake, only to find out that people in Tampa weren't really playing, and people in Miami weren't playing, and people in California weren't playing, especially back then. It just wasn't. It was a cold weather dominated sport, and we didn't know, and we lost so much money.
So your marketing survey was painful.
Yeah, it really was. It really was. So nobody knew there was no surveys on where people were playing back then. And the other mistake that we made was, we're a weekly magazine, and we need to get it on the shelves by Wednesday every week, so people can buy it on Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, Saturday, leading up to Sunday's games. So we're FedExing, boxes of heavy newsprint, FedExing next day air. We couldn't possibly make up the cost of the shipping on that. So we were getting killed, and we barely survived those early years with all the mistakes and blunders and things like that came with trying to launch a weekly fantasy football magazine when you don't know anything about the magazine business.
So how did that evolve then?
Well, we were able to stabilize the magazine business, and then in the late 90s, we launched fanball.com, and that really helped stabilize the business a lot, because now, we could publish, right to the web, and all the advantages that came with that. And fanball.com became ultimately a destination for content and contests and private leagues, and ultimately Fanball Commissioner, which was one of the early commissioner programs, and something I ended up working on a lot, and that became my main focus for many years was our commissioner product, Fanball.
Hold that thought for a second. Can you see the screen?
Oh, look at that. Wow, you went in the Wayback Machine.
Yeah, I love the Wayback
Holy
Machine.
cow.
That's 2002.
Look at that. How about that? Now, the name Rick Kamla is there. I'm really proud of some of the some of the people that we worked with back then, but Rick Kamla's been working on NBA and the NBA channel for years. And he's on the Sirius NBA channel, which is great. And look at this, talking about guys that you barely remember these people, right?
I always look for Kamla. I'm going to turn this off when we can go back to it. I remember going up, and I don't remember when it was, and it may have been separate from you guys, but I went up and did a TV show with Kamla and Paul, was it Allen? Paul Allen?
Paul Allen, yeah. Was Scott Engel involved in that?
I think he may have been involved. And what was the guy's name? Bob Rich.
Bob Rich.
And I don't know if that was part of Fanball. I don't know if that was part of Fanball or not, but I remember Kamla then, and I remember him. Yeah. He was like, we did cuts of 5-6 minute cuts, and you didn't edit it. So we did it. We did an intro, and everybody kind of said their little thing. And then we cut, and then we went to and then Camel goes, he says, I don't like my intro. I don't like my intro. And, it's like, we have to do the whole 5 minutes again. And Paul Allen says, you were fine. Just forget about it. He goes, I can't. Let's do it. And in the Rich, we had to do the whole thing because Kamla didn't like his intro. And, he obviously he was wanting to be in a TV business. I, really didn't know much about the guy because obviously he's been with the NBA for a long time.
Yeah. He's carved out a great career for himself. The funny story, and not turn this into the Rick Kamla show, but it just tells you how just serendipitous life is, Emil. Yeah. So it's year one of Fantasy Football Weekly, and we're publishing it out of my studio apartment. And on Sunday, all the guys would come in, and the address for people who want to subscribe to the magazine was just my apartment, right? So 110 Grant, Minneapolis, Minnesota, number. I put suite number down, but it was really an apartment number, 33A, right? And one day, again, this is year one, I get a knock on my door, and it's a guy who I would later find out is Rick. Rick said he loves the magazine. He was going to subscribe and noticed our address, and he's downstairs. He lives in my building. And so he said, I figure I'll just walk up and introduce myself, beg for a job. You don't have to pay me anything. I just want to be a part of this thing. And because he lived in my building, he ended up on our staff. We were eventually able to hire him. He left American Express, where he was working a corporate job that he hated. Wow. And that was the beginning of a career that ultimately led him to be on studio for the NBA channel.
That's incredible. Great story. Now back to your commissioner. I'm very interested. I didn't realize that you were a techno geeko guy. So tell me how you.
Well, I didn't.
Say what?
I didn't code it, to be clear.
Okay, but you understood it well enough. So tell me how you got that commissioner going, and what the time frames were. I didn't know about that.
So the funny thing, so this is like year 1999, 2000, and no, a little later. I'm going to go 2001. And at that time, CBS had a commissioner product, and there really wasn't much else out. ESPN didn't have theirs yet. I don't think Yahoo had theirs yet. And so some of the big players didn't have a working, functional product yet. And at the time, we were all worried that CBS was going to be such a juggernaut. There was no point in even making a competing product. But there were things that we wanted it to do that CBS's didn't do. And so we started, and we had a private league system that was already running. And we're like, all right, so how do we make a private league with set rules into a public league, and where anybody can join, and we can get all these variations on rules? And so I worked with one guy, Rudy Menendez, as our coder. And Rudy and I just started slapping features onto this thing, especially things that we wanted to do that nobody else had done yet, like blind bidding, Emil, which we were all big fans of blind bidding.
Wow.
And there was no automated system for blind bidding. So we're like, let's code that up. So if anybody wants a blind bid, they have to come to our site. We were the first one that had a record book that would track, highest scoring running back in the history of the league, highest scoring games, history of the league, stuff like that. Yeah. And so we got in early on the commissioner product, and that ultimately ended up being the single most valuable property we had at Old Fanball back then.
Is that how far did that evolve? You don't still use it today, do you? Or
no, it unfortunately. So we ended up selling Fanball in 2005, and then honestly things went pretty sour pretty fast with new ownership. And within 2 years, I was gone, Rob was gone, all the key management was gone, and the new company drove that. They drove it into the ground really quickly, and Fanball folded by 2008. I think it was dead.
Yeah. Wow. That's too bad. That is.
I know. It's sad. Yeah. You hate to. 12. As I tell people, it was 12 years to build it to the point of sale, and then within 2 years, dead. Yeah. Wow, really frustrating and sad to see that happen. Yeah,
that is sad. Same thing happened with the WCOFF when we sold it. But
I bet
we're not talking about me. The weekly magazine, the tabloid, you mailed out, but you eventually evolved onto the newsstand. When did you guys get into the newsstand?
Yeah, so we were always for sale on the newsstand, but we also had summer issues that were running right next to your magazines up on the newsstand that were the regular glossy style, regular size.
Yeah, I meant the annuals.
Yeah, the annual. Yeah. That's right. Yeah, the annuals. Yeah. And we had 3 versions that we put out over the course of the summer. Much like yourself, you've done a lot of different, you did staggered releases of yours.
Uh-huh.
And we started that really right away. We were always on the newsstand in the summer, but they weren't always in regular magazine format. That started in the late 90s, I think, and probably ran through the early 2000s before we just plain got out of the magazine business altogether and just focused on the .com.
Yeah, that sounds good. Now, I remember you guys had a syndicated radio show. At least I assume it was syndicated. Yeah. Tell me about how all that happened.
It was. Well, we started way back in 1995. We started a local fantasy radio show, mostly because people were calling into our local sports talk station. And again, this is the 90s. And they would just start asking surreptitious fantasy questions that were masked to not be fantasy questions. So they would call the host and go, Buccaneers goal line situation. Who do you think would get the ball at the goal line for the Buccaneers? And, because the Buccaneers are playing the Vikings. And so, who do you think you get the ball? So they'd be asking that kind of stuff. And the host got sick of it. So I was coming on as a periodic guest on one of the shows, a weekly guest on one of the shows. And the program director finally just said, why don't we just do a Saturday show all about fantasy football? And then we can tell all these idiots to stop calling our regular programming. They can call in on Saturday. So in 1995, we started Fantasy Football Weekly, the radio version, and it's still going today.
Wow.
And at various times, we've been nationally syndicated with the show. But yeah, we're still doing Fantasy Football Weekly even now. This will be year 26.
Wow.
Of Fantasy Football Weekly. Yeah,
I
that's a lot of talking.
Because I know you're been doing a lot of radio recently. I didn't know you have some other shows, or is it just basically that one? Or
well, for me personally, I also have a video game show that I do every Tuesday night where we talk video games.
Wow.
And we've got I also do I do 9 to noon every Friday with the regular host of our 9 to noon show, which is Paul Allen. So Paul Allen from when you were doing that show.
Yeah.
He's had a radio show for 20 years on this station, and he's the voice of the Vikings, and I join him every Friday. And then I do a lot of out of market radio during the season as well. Philadelphia, Kansas City, and Las Vegas, and all these different cities. And I love radio. So for me it's always been a fun pastime.
I've heard you a lot on the radio over the decades, and
thank you. You too.
I've always found you very engaging and very informative. And I found a little quote where you used the word infotainment. You remember using that word?
Yeah. I mean, that was really always the goal for the magazine from day one. Was we wanted it to be funny, and we wanted to be lighthearted, and we wanted to make fun of players who deserved to get needled. And, we had silly nicknames for all kinds of players. Bam Morris. You remember Bam Morris?
Yes.
He was, ran into all kinds of drug trouble. We called him Bong Morris. We cracked jokes all the time, and that was part of it. Part of it was, anybody can sort of just throw dry stats at you. We're going to try to be different by being silly in with it, and we'll let people, parse out which parts of the fun and which parts of the entertainment and information. And that was always our goal, and it remains that way with our radio shows today too.
Well, Bob Harris and I always talk about entertainment and information, and that's basically what you're saying is people want to be entertained while you're informing them. It's part of the fun of it.
They do.
And I say you guys did a great job of that, and you do a great job of that.
And you guys are great at it too. And Bob's become just an astounding radio talent. He's on all the time. And what people will tell you is they want to be informed, but in reality, what they want is to be entertained. And the entertainment goes a lot farther than the information does in the perception of what you're doing and how people engage with you.
That's fascinating. Did you go to the 1998 Tropicana conference in Las Vegas?
So, okay, there's a story behind that.
Oh, good. I love stories.
There is. Okay, so here it is. 1996, we host in the Twin Cities. We host the first ever real gathering of fantasy sports players called the Fantasy Football Expo, and we bring in Chris Mortensen as our lead expert to talk through the NFL. And this is in the preseason. It's in August, and we bring him in, and when all these people come in, and we do this in 96, we do this in 97, and we have a loose association with two guys who have got a website, James Sarah and another guy, and I forget his name. Jim Lenz, exactly. And we didn't have a website back then, so we would just basically throw free promotion their way. We flew those guys in for our event, for the Fantasy Football Expo events in 96 and 97. We flew them in and put them on the podium and let them talk, and we did a lot of stuff with them. Well, they decided to do their own competing event, and that was the Tropicana event. And the next year, so 98, they did the Tropicana event, and my understanding is they got like literally no attendees, or like 5 attendees or something like that. And so they brought in a bunch of people from the industry that were going to be speakers, and we're going to, fill it out. But there was nobody to attend, because they didn't know nobody was playing in Las Vegas. Like we didn't know nobody was playing in Miami and all these other places. Right. So, they had gone to the Minnesota event. We were drawing like 1,000 people. And so they were like, wow, it's 1,000 people. We'll do it in Las Vegas. Everybody will fly in, whatever. So I think that's the event you're referring to. I'm pretty confident. I think it was those guys who started it, but we didn't go because we felt a little bit betrayed, because we had treated them like VIPs at our thing, and then they spun up a competing one.
So I did not know that. That's interesting. And of course, I've talked to those guys and was at the event, and they never did mention the Fantasy Football Expo of 96 and 97 to me, but maybe I forgot. But when you did your expos, now I remember, because did you do those at the actual stadium?
Yeah, we did versions of them. In one was actually on the floor of the Metrodome at the end of its life. I think 1999 might have been the last one, or 2000 might have been the last one, and we did it on the floor of the Metrodome in its final year.
Yeah. So, but you didn't invite any other companies to come, or was it just you guys?
We did. No, we did. Yeah, like Rick Wolf used to come to those, and
cool.
We had Steve Cohen and Adam Kaplan, and we had, a lot of people, and you could buy booths and you could come in. And so we did have industry people there. Charlie Wiegert, who you know well. Yeah. Charlie would have his CDM booth there, and they were part of it as well.
Well, I wish I had done that. I don't know why I didn't come. I feel stupid now that I didn't come to that, but who knows what I was thinking back then.
I'm not sure we even, we didn't really know each other back then, which is too bad. I wish we had.
Yeah, well, that's a great story. I love that story. You don't happen to have any old images of those, or any document, images?
Somewhere I probably do, and when I do, I will scan them and I will send them to you.
Yeah, I'm, kind of doing a history here, and it would be cool to have that one.
I know,
really fantastic. So,
well, you've become the unofficial archivist of fantasy sports, which is fantastic. I love all the work that you're doing, the recognition for the old timers like me. I think it's great.
Well, it doesn't pay well, but it's fun. But yeah, I don't know. There's something wrong with me. I love the history of things, and of course, fantasy football is such a unique thing because it was so, we created, all these people created it way back from, it started in the late 50s, but that's another argument that people have with me. But so it's been around for a long time, and we've got all this great history. Why not try and document it as best you can? And I thought videos would be a fantastic way to do it, because you really get more out of a video, in my opinion.
I think you're right. By the way, I'm Team Goppel on the starting of fantasy sports. What are you? Where do you stand on the start of fantasy sports?
Well, it started with Winkenbach in the late 50s, baseball and golf, and then he did football. He bought 10% of what would eventually be the Oakland Raiders. They weren't called that then, and they were part of the AFL in 1962. And then, he went. There's all stories about it, which is where I think are accurate. Basically, what people don't really understand is he says, "Oh, we got to market this team." So he and a couple of the other guys said, "Oh, let's take the baseball and the golf, which I have the baseball bylaws and rules from back then, and convert them into the football rules, and I have a copy of that." And started this thing, and in the league, you could, you had to be part of the Raiders. You had to be a ticket guy or the color commentator, or you had to do something that was important with the Raiders. And not to get off on a beaten path, what I'm very good at is I find it very interesting. For all these years of watching the NFL hate fantasy and all the evolution that we can talk about,
I know.
is fantasy football was started to support what would end up being the NFL, essentially part of the
Yes.
NFL in the Raiders. That to me is just incredible. And
I remember the old days. So we're doing our weekly magazine, and it was so hard to get information. Sometimes I would call teams, and it'd be like, hello, Paul Charchian, Fantasy Football Weekly. I'm the publisher. We're just trying to understand your depth chart. Can you help me with hello? Yeah, click. As soon as you said fantasy, conversation dead with almost all the teams.
They were annoyed to the max when you called the PR department. And as a matter of fact, Bob Harris, and we've got his interview, he actually got many of the PR departments to redirect people to him when they called, which was which was a help in his business.
Really?
Because it's so funny how upset they were. They were so upset about being bugged, and then they were worried when it got a little more popular about it associating with gambling.
Right.
And then they tried to take it over. Once they said, maybe this is helping us. Let's take it over. Let's sue everybody. Take it over.
Now we want to own it.
Exactly, which is kind of annoying. It's ironic all that happened. So now I got off of my train of thought. But I didn't know I forgot about that expo. I'm so glad you reminded me about that. So somewhere around, you got into the trade association. By the way I understand the trade association was started is at that evil expo in Tropicana, that kind of spurred everybody to, hey, maybe we ought to have a business to business, thing every once in a while. And that actually helped start the trade association the next year or whenever that was. But so tell me about how you got involved in the trade association.
Well, we joined right away, even though it started this other trade conference, but we were supported all, from the beginning. And so Fanball was one of the very first companies to join the association. Rob was on the board for a long time. And then I got on the board in the mid 2000s. I got elected onto the board. There was a board shakeup. You may remember at one point the FSTA it kind of split between companies that supported the leagues trying to own fantasy and companies that didn't, which was the majority of our membership that did not. But there were a bunch of people on the board that worked for big companies that were invested in the leagues. And so they went out and started a competing trade organization that supported the league's attempt to monopolize fantasy sports.
You mean the FSA?
The FSA. That's right.
I do remember that.
Yep. And so we, that created a bunch of openings on the board, and I was one of the people that jumped in. And for whatever reason, they made me chairman right off the bat. And I think it was only because I knew Robert's Rules of Orders, and so I could actually run the business meeting, and nobody else knew it. And the business meetings on the calls were basically like, hey, before I started, they're like, hey, what do you want to talk about? I don't know. What do you want to talk about? And so then when I came on board, we started running him on Robert's Rules of Order. I was the chairman. And then when JT stepped down, they were nice enough to elect me as the president.
Yeah. So was that something that you were thinking about before JT stepped down, or in your mind, or?
No, not really. And I was never angling to be president, but I think mostly because it's unpaid and it's a lot of work. It's mostly like, who's the sucker who's willing to be president? And I was the guy who raised my hand. And at the time I was fortunate in that I owned my own company. So I didn't have to, I was just starting League Safe then. So this is like 2007, 2008.
Yeah.
And I didn't have to answer to anybody. Everybody, for most other people, you can't just devote 15 hours out of your work day to the FSGA or the FSTA, and because you got a real job. But I didn't have to answer to anybody, so I went ahead and did it.
So tell me some of the highlights of being the president for 11 years, over those 11 years.
Well, a couple of things. One of the big things was our industry events, which you've attended many, and you've been instrumental in supporting over the years, were at the time in late August and late March, right before the start of the season. And that was killing everybody because we're all so busy right then. So one of the very first things that I did was to move our industry events to January and June so that people could attend when they weren't in the height of their busiest part of the year. And that was a pivotal change. I also went out of my way, I think, to make sure that LeagueSafe, my company, didn't get anything special out of it. There had been a lot of accusations that board members or people that, had tried to get special consideration of some kind. We tried not to do that, which I think worked out pretty well. And then, of course, the whole rise of DFS was amazing. And, you were there for a lot of this. And to see DFS blow up, then to have it on the front page of the New York Times and, the 6 months of just chaos with, all of the craziness that happened with FanDuel and DraftKings and sort of surviving that and then starting this march towards legalization and state-by-state lobbying. I mean, these are all things that were, we were a tiny nonprofit association that's getting pulled into national legislation and conferences with governors and legislators, and we had to evolve and as an association in a really meaningful way and quickly. And that was fascinating, Emil, to see all of that go down and to be able to support our member companies through all that change and to ultimately become formally recognized as a game of skill, not a gambling game in 19 states. It's huge. So really proud of all the things that went on through the legalization process as well.
Well, congratulations. It was a hell of a ride, and you did a fantastic job.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, I remember.
And as you probably know, we a year ago we broadened the scope of the association to include legalized gambling companies, which some people are like, hey, you told us for years you're not gambling, and fantasy isn't gambling, but we have so many of the same interests with gambling companies that we decided that it was in the best interest for everybody. The fantasy guys who wanted to know that industry better, the gambling people who wanted to have access to fantasy customers and all the know-how of fantasy, and our state-by-state legislation march that we decided to broaden the association and include both.
Yeah, that's been. I remember the Dallas conference. I forget what year it was. It was like at the height of everything with DFS and then all the stuff. I remember, I think we had like 440 attendees at that conference, and
That's
it
right.
was like you can't find them. There were so many people. It's like you wanted to meet these people, and you're walking around looking at badges. You can't even find it. It was such a huge conference that week. It was fantastic.
It was. I think that was 2016, and that was still DFS. The whole FanDuel DraftKings thing was still front page news at that time.
Oh yeah.
But you remember Mark Cuban came to that conference. Mm-hmm. We were in Dallas, so it wasn't hard for him. And he came on stage and he was very smart. He said, what's going to happen is people love fantasy. They're going to keep playing. You're going to weather this. And the companies that are still here in 2 and 3 years, you're going to be in great shape. And ultimately he was proven right. There was 1 million knockoffs for FanDuel and DraftKings at that conference. Do you remember that? Everybody had FanDuel with a sprint.
Yeah, there was a bunch of them. It was an incredible explosion. Well, ironically, now we're facing another situation with the coronavirus, and I don't mean to minimize it, but obviously it's affecting businesses all in the world, and it's going to affect fantasy sports businesses too. So we'll see what happens there.
For sure.
Also, you were inducted into the Fantasy Sports Hall of Fame, and I don't remember the exact date that happened. So that was another great milestone that you had.
Yeah, that was recognition from your peers. Of course, it feels great, and that was never a goal. But when you're an old timer like us, it feels awfully nice to be recognized, and it's. I think it's probably less for Fantasy Football Weekly or Fanball and the things that I did, but probably more for the FSGA and the work that we did there, which is all very flattering, and we're honored to be in the Hall of Fame for that.
So tell us a little more about LeagueSafe.
Well, the premise of LeagueSafe was, and I started working on it in 2007, and we launched on a small scale 2008, was you've got these people who are dealing with league finances, and then things either go wrong or it's complicated or it's just not convenient dealing with the league fees. And it could be that your commissioner just doesn't pay on time. Your commissioner's not safe. You don't know your commissioner because you have a league that's formed online. You got 12 people that are scattered, that met on the internet and they want to play. Well, who's going to hold the money? And so we created basically a fantasy sports escrow service. And we feel like it's the first consumer safety company in the fantasy sports space. And Emil, you'll appreciate this. When I started LeagueSafe, everybody said, you're going to run off with the money. All these people are going to pay you the money to hold during the season, and you're going to take off with the funds. And I'm happy to say LeagueSafe is going strong now. Today, 10 years later, only 10 years later. We never ran off with the money. But it was built then. This was right as the economy was right before the economy collapsed in the housing market. Wow. Interest rates were 4% and 5%. So the plan with LeagueSafe was we were just going to make money on interest. And we weren't going to charge anybody anything because the interest was going to generate so much money that it would there'd be no transaction fees of any kind, and we would just make interest, and that was going to be the plan. And it would have been great. But the housing bubble burst and interest rates went to zero, and they're still basically zero today. And we had to pivot and find new ways to keep the company going.
Yeah. Oh, that's an incredible story. It's interesting how, obviously you had great credibility, which helped you create LeagueSafe. And I remember back when we created the WCOFF, and that was in 2002. And we're taking $1,500 from people and saying, meet you in Vegas.
Yeah.
What if they come in and it's a blank? Right. What if it's an empty room when they show up? So we had to.
That's right.
These people had to trust us, me and Lenny Papano. And I remember halfway through that summer, everybody was sitting on the fence. There were a lot of people sitting on the fence, and so we guaranteed prizes. So literally, Lenny and I sat down over the phone and said, okay, if we don't get any more people to sign up and we guarantee prizes, it's going to cost us about $200,000 divided by 2. You good with that?
Wow.
We go, all right, let's try it. Lenny was petrified.
Wow.
He was petrified.
I bet. But
guaranteeing prizes, then everybody, the rest of the people bought in. We ended up making money the first year. But we had that same issue is, who are these guys? Are they going to take my money? And those are tough, those are tough scenarios because I assume you're taking all the league's prize money. And
that's right.
You're going to give it back. And that's interesting. I didn't really think about that. That's fantastic.
You had to fight the same battle. And even harder, I think, for you guys was there had been some bad actors in that space prior to you that ended up spending the money. And they didn't make good on some of their prize obligations.
Yeah, I don't remember those are.
I don't remember the names either, but I remember with the FSTA that it caused quite a bit of ruckus because there were companies that, well, actually, I do remember some. I just don't want to say the names.
Okay.
That didn't end up making good on their prize obligations, and that affected you trying to run a legitimate company, make good on your prizes.
Yeah, those are interesting days. You did say you were starting a new company. I don't know if you want to talk about it on here or not.
Sure. I'm starting a new company around the Guillotine League format of play, Emil. And for people that don't know, the Guillotine League premise is this. You start with 17 teams at the beginning of the year, and every week, there's no head-to-head. Every week, the low-scoring team in the league gets chopped from the league, and their players go to the waiver wire. So now everybody gets to feast on all of these amazing players. All the players you drafted hit the waiver wire. And so now, here's Emil. You start the season with $1,000 mythical dollars to spend in blind bidding, and Ezekiel Elliott just hit the waiver wire. Week 1, he hits the waiver wire. What do? Do you push in a bunch of your chips? Do you push in 800 of your 1,000 to get Zeke, knowing you could start him for the rest of the year potentially? Or do you hold, knowing next week it might be Julio Jones and it might be anybody, any players who end up getting cut? And so it's fascinating strategy. It's a ton of fun. You feel absolute anxiety every week about, is this the week I get cut? You never feel safe. And it's a blast. The format's a ton of fun. So starting up a new company just to sort of build and grow the Guillotine audience and give people a destination for playing that way.
How long do you think the guillotine format has been around?
Well, I know how long it's been around because I named it, and
Did you really?
it's funny. I did. So somebody tweeted me 2 years ago about the way they were playing this way. I'm like, that's brilliant. And so I did a test on it with just some friends around the office, and we did it for a year, and we loved it. And so I'm like, yeah, I got to come up with a catchy name for this, and just ultimately settled on Guillotine Leagues, and started. And it's sort of fun, yeah. So we named it, and then just started popularizing this style of play. And I'm sure most listeners right now or viewers right now aren't familiar with it. It's still brand new. It's still new. But I think it's got legs, and I think you're going to hear a lot more about Guillotine Leagues over the years.
I mean, I've heard about it for a few years. I haven't played it yet, but I'll have to play it. What do you do about ties?
I think you should.
What do you do about ties for blind bidding?
We break ties the way that most traditional people do it. We do it by giving preference by points scored over the course of the whole season. So there's still kind of a leaderboard. Not that it really matters, because you could be the highest scoring team year to date. You could be the highest scoring team, but if you're the low scorer that week, you're dead. You're out. So I mean, you never feel safe. But so for all of our tiebreakers, even if there's a tie on the low scoring team, we give preference to the teams that have scored the most points for the season.
It sounds good. I love it. So
it's fun.
What do you have any interesting stories, funny stories from this last? How long has it been? 28 years.
20. Yeah, no kid. That is, God, it's been that long. Jeez. Yeah. Well, there's been plenty of ups and downs, right? We had a work stoppage scare twice during my time with this. One was legit. We had a work stoppage, and then we had to live through work stoppages. That was certainly tricky. We've had a few board members that have managed to get themselves in trouble over the years. We've had to let some of the association board members go. That hasn't happened recently, I'm happy to say. And so, that there's certainly been some drama there. We've had, here's a story for you that you do not know, but you know the people involved.
Okay.
So, do you remember Ian Allen's magazine, which of course, Fantasy Football Index? Do you remember the original name of his magazine?
Yeah, it was called Fantasy Football.
That's right. Exactly. It was called Fantasy Football. Unbeknownst to us, when we started Fantasy Football Weekly, the magazine, he had a fax service that was part of the magazine that was called Fantasy Football Weekly, because the magazine was Fantasy Football. It wasn't Index yet. It was just Fantasy Football, and the fax service was called Weekly. So we start the magazine, Fantasy Football Weekly, and we start sending it out nationally, and sooner or later, it comes to the attention of Ian Allen. So Ian and Bruce sent us a cease and desist letter. Actually, it wasn't a cease and desist. It wasn't by a lawyer. It was just them writing to us. And I think Bruce actually wrote it. They're like, hey, we got this thing called Fantasy Football Weekly, and you've got this magazine, Fantasy Football Weekly. We need to do something about this. They sort of inferred that they wanted us to come up with a new name. We felt like, and at the time, I'm a young man. This is my baby. I was so crestfallen to get the letter. Now, and I was even a little bit irate about getting the letter, to be honest, because I felt like their fax service should not count, and things like that. Now, as time went on, I got to know these guys, and they're great guys and great people. Loved them. And later, I went back and read the letter, and it couldn't have been nicer. It couldn't have been more conciliatory. It was just two guys that were like, hey, let's work this out. And at the time, I was just a sea of emotion over this thing. I bet. And it turned out that it was super nice, and they were great guys. And they ultimately figured out that they couldn't, just fantasy football was too generic. They needed to become Index. And that's what they ended up doing. And great people. And sometimes in the heat of battle, you get emotional, and I think that's probably what happened. But they couldn't have been more professional about it.
That's a good one. I mean, I remember, trademarking. I sent a trademark in for fantasy sports publications, and I had a little whistle or something, and I got it back X months later, and it says, okay, the whistle's trademarked, the name's not, it's too generic. I'm like, what? I didn't understand stuff.
Okay.
it's the same thing. You need to call it Paul's Fantasy Football Weekly, or they need to call their thing the Index.
Yeah.
I remember talking to Ian a few weeks ago. We did him on the interview, and he said, we didn't really think about anybody else doing magazines. We just called it Fantasy Football. It's funny how you start.
Right. Right. Yeah,
and then
it really is.
They started seeing, other ones come out and got annoyed. But that is a tough story. That's a good one.
Yeah.
What's the Utah Raptor? You called yourself Utah Raptor?
No, I don't know what that is.
Oh, it was somewhere.
I don't know what Utah Raptor is. That is not me.
Anyway,
that's
I interrupted you. What were you about to say, if you remember?
No, I was just one more thing on Ian. I mean, just super class guy. Been doing this so long, and fascinating. Just a fascinating individual. A constant runner, marathoner. Works. He's been been in this business for a very long time, making this magazine, and it's just such a sort of testament to the longevity and the popularity of the magazine that he hasn't just like exploded into a million different things. Like I've done all these different things. He's had this one trajectory with this magazine, and he's mostly just stayed with this magazine. I know they've got a website and some other things that they do, but it's still the magazine's the pillar. And I just think it's amazing that Ian's been able to keep this going for this long, and it's a testament to just who he is and the kind of personality that he has. It's great.
Yeah, he's driven, hardworking. They've done a great job, and started in '87, right out of college. And the Grogans, I don't know if you remember the Grogans, they started in '86.
Oh, you bet I do.
They started in '86 with the magazine. And
Kelly, it was Kelly, and it Kelly and who was his brother? Dan. Kelly and Dan Grogan. Yeah. Absolutely. One of them was on the board when I joined, I believe.
Oh, okay.
I think it was Kelly. Yeah. Yeah, he was. And where were they? They were Denver, right?
Yeah, they're in Colorado. I did an interview with them a few weeks ago. It's pretty good. It was great memories, and learned a few more things about them. They actually still have a couple copies of their first magazine from '86. It's pretty rough, they said. They actually had it typed. They had a lady type it.
Wow, no way.
Yeah.
Wow.
And they just put it locally, and it did well, so they, evolved after that. So kind of interesting how all that works.
About that.
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, gosh. Go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say, when you get into the magazine business, so you want to start a magazine, and you'll appreciate this because you know what I'm talking about. I didn't know anything about page layout. I didn't know how to put words on a printed page. I knew how to write, but I didn't know how to do any of that stuff. So I had to buy a laptop, spend a bunch of money for a program called Adobe PageMaker. I had to go learn how to do layout, and I was terrible at it. I had no training. I didn't know how to make anything look good. I don't know how to get words on a page. It looked awful. But that was, that's what you did back then. We were bootstrapping everything. We couldn't pay for anybody to do anything else. And we just did it all. Yeah.
That's fantastic. I started out in 1990 with, I'm pretty sure it was Word Perfect. And it was on
that was the word processor. Yeah. I taught Word Perfect when I was doing computer training in college.
That's pretty good. Yeah, there was a compact I had. I had a little portable compact thing. I don't remember. It's scary that we actually produced stuff with those technologies back then compared to what we have now.
Now, did you have a compact that was like a small suitcase?
Yep. It wasn't that big. Small screen.
Okay. All right.
It was probably the typical compact. And this is 90, so, this was a long time ago.
It is a long time ago. So that was... You're probably putting together a magazine on a screen that was, yay big.
Yep.
And trying to do, all page layouts and everything on this tiny little screen. That was tough days.
And I remember the first couple of years, or may have been the first year, that I would do an indexing. I forget how it worked, but you'd ran this index program, so you'd have an index at the back, and literally it took like 5 hours. And I remember I was so exhausted. I would actually start the indexing, and then I'd lay down in the study and slept for 5 hours and woke up, and then it's done. It's really scary.
And now that same process would take like 1 second.
Yeah. It probably automatically does it every time you update something.
Yeah, you're probably right.
I remember my dad. When I did the first magazine, and it was a spiral bound thing that we did locally, and we did mail order also through Pro Football Weekly's tabloid. And he came over, in like September or something when the season was finished, or the season to sell the product was. He walked in the front door, and I remember, handing him the magazine. I says, "Dad, look what I created." And he looked at it for a couple seconds, and he looked at me, and he said 6 words. "How much money did you lose?" That's my support system there.
Yeah, right there. It's funny. I have the opposite story. We launched it here in the Twin Cities. We had an association with a former Viking tight end named Joe Sensor. And most of you won't remember Joe Sensor. You might, Emil. He had probably an 8-year career as a Vikings tight end.
Wow.
And he owned a chain of restaurants in the Twin Cities. And so we wanted him to advertise. So we showed him the magazine, and he says, I'll advertise. I'll take it. This is great. He played fantasy football. He totally got it. And he said, "What are you going to do with your first $1 million?"
Whoa.
So I got the opposite answer that you got from your dad. He saw the potential in fantasy football.
Wow, that is good. Oh, by the way, I didn't ask before. When did you first learn about fantasy football? The day you discovered fantasy football. Do you remember that?
Yeah. I learned it from a friend, like most of us did, whose mom had played. So, she was a real early adopter especially for among females. And so she had played and this was, okay, wait, I'm going to tell you there's a 2-part story.
Okay.
Number one, some kids, when I was in middle school, some kids mentioned the idea. This is 1980. They mentioned this idea of drafting guys and getting points based on what they did. I don't remember if they called it fantasy football or not. And they said, tomorrow we're going to have the draft at lunch. Okay. So I didn't do any prep. There was no prep to be done. Nobody knew. I don't know what they were doing. So we just had a draft. You just threw out names as they came to you off the top of your head, and then that was your team. Well, I took hot rookie quarterback. My first pick was hot rookie quarterback Phil Simms.
Oh, wow.
Not knowing any better, right? I'm just a middle schooler, and I knew Phil Simms because he was the hot rookie right then. But then did not play again until 87, and then I have not stopped playing. So, and in fact, that league has been going this whole time. So,
wow.
1987, I think Tony Dorsett was my first draft pick, but I'm not positive.
Wow, that's a
How
good
about
story.
you? When did you start?
I started in 81. My magazine
81.
partner, Bill Robertson's, we used to go over to each other's house on Monday nights and watch Monday Night Football. And in 81, we showed up to his house, and he had this piece of paper, had this piece of paper with names on it. I says, "What are you doing?" He goes, "Oh, so-and-so's got a score tonight. I got to win." I said, what is it? He says, "Oh, it's fantasy football. This is my roster, and I'm playing against somebody." And I went, "Huh?" I started a league in 2 weeks, my first league, the Watermelon Football League, and it's still running. And a few people have passed away, luckily not me, and those are long. I mean, it's go ahead.
Why watermelon?
We live in Albuquerque, and the mountains are Sandia Mountains, which means watermelon in Spanish. So watermelon,
all right.
And we spun it off of a league called the Albuquerque Pro Football League that started around 78. And we stupidly said, well, let's just call it, Watermelon Pro Football League, because of the Sandia. And we worked at Sandia Labs, which is a national security laboratory in Albuquerque. So also most of the people, actually everybody in the league was from Sandia Labs.
Wow, no lack of brain power in that league.
No, and the funny thing is, it was 6 points per score. Period.
Yes,
quarterbacks. That's it. 39 years later, is it 39 years or the 40th season? Still the same. They won't change the rules.
Wow.
And I'll come in, and I'll we have an hour talk before we meet once a year, second Saturday of August, and do our draft. But we have an hour of rules meetings. So every once in a while, I'll mention, what's going out in the real world. And they get mad at me. They get mad and start telling me, this is the greatest league. It's like, I'm glad you're proud of your league, but it would be more interesting and creative. They just get mad at me. I just why do I even mention it? They just can't change. I don't know why. Well, it's a dynasty league, so they're afraid that you change the rules and now their team may not be as good, whatever. I almost find it humorous how defensive they become about changing rules.
Well, you're right. You have two kinds of mindsets. One is, the kind you're talking about. They're conservative. This is the rules we agreed to play on. We're playing this way, Dynasty League. Don't want to change everything now because all of a sudden my team's not as good or whatever. And then you've got the people that are just, they always want the churn and they always want the change. And that's like, you've got a bunch of guys that like playing that way and there's so much history, right?
Yeah.
If you have the highest scoring game of all time in week 1 of next year, that's a pretty big deal. You just set a 39-year record.
Yeah, that's a good point.
There's something to the consistency, right?
You make a good point. That is definitely a good point. And some of these guys only play in 2 or 3 leagues that they've kind of spun off of this one over the decades. So they're that's their little world where you and I see all these crazy things. You got the guillotines and you got all these creative ideas. And of course, we got PPR and points for yardage and even some distance scoring and flex. I finally got them to add a flex position. It was just scary.
Ooh,
huge
all right.
I don't know why that annoys me. It's just funny. But I'm trying to make it more interesting, and we've grown to 14 teams, and it's so hard to find free agents. The Duke Johnsons of the world really are meaningless in this league.
They're worthless.
Yeah.
Right.
So you've got all these players
that
don't do anything, but it's kind of fun.
No, you need to find the Larry Kinnebrews. I like throwing out old names at you.
Oh yeah, that's a good one.
Larry Kinnebrews, your goal line backs, right?
How about Marion Butts?
Yeah, Marion Butts. Yeah.
4 carries, 2 touchdowns.
That's right.
4
carries, 3 yards, right? 2 touchdowns. That's right.
And in the Watermelon Pro Football League, gold.
That's right, gold.
Just gold. Well, this has been great. Go ahead. I'm sorry.
He adorned a cover of Fantasy Football Weekly one issue. I remember our Marion Butts cover. Well, because we had a million headlines to use with a name like Marion Butts, right? There's a million ways you can go with that. So we had a lot of fun with it. I don't remember what we finalized it on, but most of the fun was the names you could never have published.
Yes, of course. Yeah, I've got probably within 10, 20 feet of me right now. I've probably got a handful of your weekly magazine.
Wow,
because
that's awesome.
I got it.
Thank you.
I got it for several years. Once a week, and I'm so
that's
disorganized. I can't even find half of anything in this room, but I'm sure it's really close by. Yeah, those are great times. Well, man, I'll tell you what. It's you and I are the old guys. So it's kind of neat reminiscing on how all this happened. But, you've had a great career, and just congratulations on everything you've done.
You too. You're one of the absolute founders, pioneers, and I'm very, 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 very fortunate and flattered that I can call you a friend. It means a lot.
Yeah, it's thank you. I was on the board for 6 years. I worked as hard as I could.
Yeah.
I got to got a little older, and I really wanted to work on my business, and I realized I really couldn't help as much, so I didn't re-up on my election, and I'm just trying to get to retirement here.
6 years is a long time. You did your time. You did your time. Thank you.
It was fun. It was
a pleasure to work with you.
Yeah, me too.
Absolutely.
Well, thank you so much. And any parting words?
You.
Anything you remembered through this conversation you want to bring up?
No, I think we've covered so many things here, but it's again, how about I'll leave it at this. You never could have guessed in 1993 when I started and the late 80s when you started, never ever would have guessed it'd be like this. 50 million people playing. I mean, you never could have seen it coming. We always thought it'd just be something for a handful of shut-ins, like us that, love numbers and love sports and never thought it would be something that like 1 in 3 men are playing. It's just changed so
How many
much.
people watch the NFL? I don't know what that number is. Yeah. Is it 100 million? I mean, you're telling me half the league half the people who watch NFL play fantasy? Well, the 50 million isn't just the NFL, but still, it's a high percentage.
Right. It is. Yeah.
Well, thank you so much.
It's been a pleasure.
Yeah,
thank you.
We will talk soon.